Living in lower Alabama, we rarely receive snow. I spent most of my life wishing for a white Christmas that never came. I have only seen snow twice in my 33 years here. I always wanted to share that with my two boys. I just knew that they would love to play in it. Now I found myself staring out at our window at the mounds of icy precipitation surrounding my home, regretting every wish I had made of that snow-covered Christmas. When you think about it, it really all started in the summer. Our summers were usually very hot and very humid, but that year was just even more unbearable. We steadily saw the temperatures well over 100 degrees, and everyone knew I begged for relief. The heat wave lasted all the way till the end of the week before Halloween. Then, suddenly, a massive hurricane spawned in the Gulf of Mexico. Weather forecaster in our local news frequently referred to as a monster. Looking back, I would believe it was more of a demon that brought hell with it, much different than the ones that I have ever read in the Bible. The storm passed, leaving devastation for miles around, and it had affected every state in the southeast, but Florida most of all. Help was sent from various utility companies, government aid agencies, and even our regular citizens to help with the relief. And when I say various, I mean every state of our region. It was then amazing to see the effort put into the help that lost people that lost everything. I am sure a lot of us have went through it when it was the worst it could get. I wish it had been true, but it was then the rain had started. As November came, we felt the first droplets of our tiny town. It was an odd occurrence, but not odd enough to raise any eyebrows. I mean, how badly could a couple of days of rain worth be? The problem came when the days turned into weeks and low-lying areas became flooded. Homes in town nearby were washed away in the matters of hours once the leaves broke. My wife Susan constantly thanked God for that her house was nestled on top of the high elevation among the trees. I found myself thinking the same thing, but God had other things to deal with, and oh God, I could ever be in that way. The week of Thanksgiving, the rain had finally subsided, and I'm pretty sure that's something everyone would say that they were thankful for. The problem is, what remained was the cold. That in its own self was not strange, but the severity of it was. We saw the temperatures close to freezing for the following week, and that was something we rarely saw until late January or early February. My oldest son Jacob began singing that song by Bing Crosby. My wife beamed at the thought of them seeing snow on Christmas Day, and the foolish child in me felt the same. "The boys will finally get a chance to see snow, Paul," Susan squealed. "I know. I can't wait to see Tommy waddling in it," I responded. In those words that are in my head now, I have to fight back tears whenever I just think how stupid I could have been. We were all so preoccupied with the setting up the decorations and buying presents that we're oblivious to what was happening around us. The snow actually started falling the first week of December. It was up several inches within the first day. It was amazing to see, but when it kept coming, some people became worried. If you have ever been in the South when it snows, you probably would not understand. You see, we are not prepared for that kind of weather. Everything shuts down, people stay home, and rarely go out driving. I know it sounds ridiculous to anyone, but that's just what happens. It just kept coming. My wife and I had to let the boys play in the fresh powder originally, but when it had gotten so high that I could barely walk in freely, we decided that it would be best to keep them indoors. Hardware stores did bring in snow shovels to help clear paths, something that you would rarely find in our town. I bought one of the last ones on the shelves as people scrambled to the icy foraging invader. The situation seemed to have begun worse when the small flurries became near blizzards. My wife stayed glued to the news and the weather broadcasts. It appeared that northern states had been almost buried in the frigid powder. The president had actually issued a state of emergency, urging people in the northern portion to evacuate to south. That was when I finally started to become concerned. All those people had been told to come to south, but our situation was hardly any better. The weatherman stopped trying to be accurate, and his predictions of the end-to-end madness never came. The temperatures continued to drop, and it was not before long when we saw them go from 0 to negative digits. I was unheard of my state for it. That would be cold, and people would be getting afraid. Plumbing fixtures began to burst from the frozen pipes, and people were left without water until they could thaw. Our world had become a freezer within the few weeks. None of us were prepared for it. My family found themselves wearing our thickest clothing, and even inside, it felt like no matter how high I set the thermostat, it was just not enough. We should live left then. By Christmas, we had no power, and utility companies had stopped trying to traverse the harsh conditions to repair downed lines. Local officials had abandoned emergency protocols to save themselves. We had began hearing rumors that our neighbors attempting to head further south into Florida. Susan suggested the same, but I reminded her of the destruction that we still had left from the hurricane. I was afraid that it would have been worse off without shelter, so I made the decision to hunker down in our home. I cleared a path to the fireplace that could only be used for decoration, set up a task of getting the fire going. If it was not such a dire situation, my wife would have found the amusement in me attempting something like that. I had never seen someone use the fireplace, let alone light one. After several attempts, we were able to burn what little wood was readily available near our home. My family and I huddled around it, as if it were going to save us from the fate we watched outside. The whiteness had engulfed our home, the mounds and the resin above the windows, breaking some of them. I was forced to reinforce them to keep the cold out. We sealed every crack and crevice that could possibly let out the heat and tried to remain together. My wife wrapped our children in blankets and pulled them close. My boys did not understand what we were afraid to tell them, how serious the situation was. The fear that rested on my wife's face was enough to keep me running what could be our last Christmas. We still attempted to save a big dinner. Despite our ability to effectively cook, I also learned how to cook within a fireplace for the first time. It would have been an interesting experiment if I had not been for the essential for their survival at the time. We gave up on the idea of turkey or ham, but we always had a decent stock of canned food. It was a habit I picked up from my grandparents. I often wondered how they were faring during out all this and my immediate family to worry about. Our world had been plunged into the endless sea of white. I even had nightmares of this stuff on Christmas Eve. My children normally woke me up on Christmas morning, but when my eyes fluttered open, I assumed it was still night. The house was so dark that I could barely see my wife sleeping next to me. I slowly rose from my bed, still completely clothed, and nudged Susan awake. The house had become far cooler than it would have been, and I immediately headed for the fireplace. The fire had gone out at some point, so I ran out to the back door, pulling my boots. My aim was gather more wood and the fire going again, but it was as soon as the door cracked open, I was peddled with a mixture of snow and ice. It stung my face as I cursed at the door while trying to shut it again. Our home had been buried in very vicious powder, and I finally understood why no light permeated the windows. I watched my mind read 9 o'clock, but it felt much earlier. Susan stumbled into the living room, asking me what was I doing. I told her what time it was, and confusion filled her eyes. She went for the windows and was greeted with what I've already known. I do not remember ever seeing her quite so afraid that even the feeling was mutual. I buried my emotions down, knowing that I had to be strong for my family. I told her to go check on the kids while I tried to get the fire going again. She disappeared from down the hall, and I made my way to the dining room. The table and chairs had been passed down from my family for many generations, but I knew it would have to be sacrificed. I set in dismantling the wooden chairs, but it was stopped by the sound of my wife's scream. I rushed to the hall, listening to the awful sound that echoed my ears. I could feel that there was something, tears forming in my eyes. But when I pushed them to the background my corner, she was grasping the door frame of our children's room. We had to put two and two together so that Jacob could keep an eye on Tommy. I could see her body shaking as she stared into the room. Tears rolled over her cheeks as I turned to see inside. The windows of the room, given the weight of our captor. Despite my attempts to strengthen it, snow had buried the boys in the night, and I was noticed the flakes of white over my wife's hands. Susan had attempted to uncover them, so I could see the pale blue skin of their faces, huddled together in Jacob's bed. It would have been a sweet scene if it were not for their skin tone, something Susan and I would have taken a picture, but this was not the scene. I pulled Susan away as I tried to hold back the sick feeling in my stomach. I felt as if I could release what little Christmas dinner I had on me on the floor at every moment. Soon her sobs subsided, but when I looked into her eyes, they simply looked numb. I had seen her this way when I tried to break her from this trance. She seemed to be, but she said nothing. Her eyes not even my direction when I spoke. Something had broken inside Susan that morning, and I do not blame her. I sat right next to the fireplace, wrapped her in a blanket, while I returned to the dining room. The polished wood did not want to burn, but I was determined to give us warmth, so I did not stop until we had fire. I made it to the point to ask Susan to stay by the fire, while I returned to the boys' room. I could not have left them that way. When I reached the door, I found myself pausing just outside. I felt the warm and salty specks across my cheeks before I even saw them. I slowly stepped inside and slid on my other gloves. I finished clearing away the snow and looked as if they had not come into our room. The wood I had used to seal off the windows had struck my oldest first. It left a gash near his temple that would have knocked a grown man unconscious. I could only imagine that his 10-year-old body did not last long after. Tommy had obviously awoken later. His tiny form clung to his big brother like a teddy bear. I internally cursed myself for not putting them to bed with us that night, but I knew it was too late for that kind of thinking. I removed their bodies and wrapped them in blankets before placing them into the guest room. I took one final look at their tiny bedroom, a place that held such much joy previously. I imagined the two of them playing, sometimes bickering. My lips, on the other hand, began to curl upwards, but they could not. My eyes dropped to the floor as I turned away and shut the door. I have not returned to that room since, and I doubt I will. I just returned to the living room in hopes of comforting Susan, but when I got there on the blanket, all what remained was by the fire. A quick search of the house revealed that the back door had been opened and a tunnel had formed into the frigid wall on the other side, leaving the floor inside covered in snow. I tried to follow Susan's footsteps, but eventually they disappeared behind the solid wall of that cursed white. I could only imagine her frantically trying to dig through it, and the sound of what was above became downing on her body. I tried to dig it to find myself in search of her body, but the layer that remained was frozen solid. It was like digging my hands into cement, and I knew that Susan would have not survived it. Even in my mind, I didn't want to believe at the time. I found myself picking at it with tools anyway, feeling as if I had nothing left to do. I don't know how much I cried while working at this pointless task, but I know I had to start to freeze my cheeks. I would not stop until my arms could not lift again. That is when I sat, among the snow, stared at what my world would become. I lost track of how long I have sat there when I decided to come back to the fire. I do remember when I started burning the Christmas gifts and how hard of a choice it would have been. I opened each one slowly, savored the idea of children playing with it for the first time. I could have seen Susan standing over them with her camera in hand, and that would have been giving her biggest smile and snapping away to save each memory. She loved taking photos, but what I did not need to be captured on any sort of film. I started to feel the numbness that night. The same numbness that took over Susan earlier that day. It was as cold as the snow that surrounded me, and all I could think about had been my fault. I should have been escaped with my family when I still had the chance. I don't even know if it was pride, ignorance, or both. But the guilt hurts too much. consume me and take me away everything this holiday it was supposed to be about. I started writing this in hopes that someone reads it. I don't know if this happened to the rest of the world. Only what remains in this has happened to me. I do not know how long I can survive here. My food is running low, and I have run out of things to burn. I cannot even say for certain how long I have stayed there, since my watch has stopped turning, and since I cannot see the sun. I think I will try and dig myself out tomorrow, and if you do this, I know I did not simply give up. I just wish I'd done this sooner. I'm sorry, Susan, Jacob, and Tommy. You deserve better than this. I hope you could forgive me. Sincerely, Paul Richardson.